Once again, I totally underestimated how long it would take me to solve this project. Uh, uh. Welcome to Cosplayland, I am Alice and I have been doing a lot of sewing. Honestly, I thought at this point I would have all the gold trims and everything ready on this cosplay, but as usual, they take longer than you can imagine at the beginning. So in this video, I'm just gonna show you how I spend a lot of time sewing all the little details here and there. And yeah, as usually, I just tortured myself and decided to do most of it hand sewn. You don't have to do this, I just like doing it because I am crazy, so yeah, sorry not sorry about it. I'm not gonna dwell on this and I'm just gonna show you the video because it's gonna be a long video, longer than I expected, so I hope you like it. I started first by sewing my sleeves, then I realized that I was not going to use any lining on them, so if I left them like that, probably they were going to frail, so I decided to finish the edges before I did this again. It only takes a minute to finish the edges, and you can do this by using a zigzag stitch or your serger, or even just using pinking shears to clip those corners so they don't look so, raggedy and horrible. Now it looks much better, so let's try again. You just have to fold them in half and do a tube with this part of the sleeve. And then you just have to sew that edge. This part should be relatively easy, but it will depend on how many cuts you've got. Now, I didn't use any lining for the previous piece, but I am going to be using lining for some of the pieces that I think are more difficult to get correctly without it. For example, this piece has a lot of curves, so if I didn't use any lining on it, it would be more difficult for me to try and make that edge clean. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to be adding a piece which is exactly the same on top of it, and I'm going to be sewing the bottom part of this sleeve. There is a little trick to sew corners so they don't look bad when you are turning them. In this case, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to get to the edge and I'm going to leave the needle down, and instead of turning completely, I'm going to do 1 or 2 stitches which are parallel to the fabric before I turn completely to carry on with the other side. This way, when I turn my fabric, it's gonna create this effect which is, in my opinion, crispier, and it's much easier to turn, and you won't get all those little threads pulling out of that corner. If you've ever done it, you know what I mean. If not, give it a try because it's well worth it. But before you turn your fabric, you want to clip the extra bulk at the bottom of the fabric. So you want to cut as close to the thread as you can, but without cutting it. This is to just get rid of all that excess fabric that won't help you when you are turning it. So this is how it looks when you turn it. I told you, totally crisp, no pulling, perfect. There's no need to tell you that every time I do a seam, I always have my iron ready to make sure everything is crisp and well finished. Otherwise, it would be bulky and it wouldn't look good. So what I did was I first sewed that part, and now I'm going to be sewing the lining in a very odd way, which is not so odd if you know what you're doing. So basically I turned my fabric and I'm going to be sewing the side of my sleeve and the side of my lining at the first time, so the line is going to be completely straight on both sides. So it should look a little bit like an arrowhead, and you are just sewing the sides of both your sleeve and your lining, but not the top, because you need to put your arms through the sleeve. That's what they are for, really. Whenever I have a very long seam like this and I think that my fabric may shift somehow, what I do is I just start from the corner towards myself. This way, if there is any misalignment with the fabric, it's gonna move towards the part in which there is no fabric attached to it, and it's gonna be more easy to disguise it. Then you can just do the other side and you will notice that the crisscross of both places where the stitches are together should be pretty much perfect. Once you trim the bulk again and turn your fabric, it should look pretty much like this. This spiky part is going to be the top of our sleeves. First of all, we need to interface the lining of that part because this is going to make it a bit stiffer and it's going to stand up when you are wearing it. We are going to be doing the same as before and we are going to be sewing around those ridges and that zigzag area. Just make sure you take it slowly, turning your machine every time you get to one of those corners. Once again, don't forget to clip those corners, but make sure you do not cut the thread because otherwise you're going to have a whole new problem with it. And you also want to remove the excess bulk at the top of those spikes. And finally, you can now turn your fabric. If you're struggling with it, make sure to use the point of your scissors to help you bring those spikes out. And this is how it looks once you iron it. Also keep in mind that I did the same technique as before and I'm going to be sewing the circle of my sleeve as before, making this kind of arrowhead to sew the sleeve part and then sew the lining as well. Now that I have all the pieces ready, I'm going to put them together. You see, I'm just putting my sleeve inside the other sleeve and first of all, I'm just gonna baste it with a long stitch on my machine so they stay together. And then I'm going to turn the top of my sleeve so I can put it on top of that bottom part of the sleeve. I'm just going to be sewing the actual sleeve and not the lining because I'm going to be hiding that later on. So here you go. I'm using those 3 layers that you saw before, the real sleeve part of the top of my sleeve and the other 2 that I basted together, and I'm just going to be sewing all around it. Once I had it, I turned my sleeve inside out. This is how it looks from the outside, it's all sewn, and now we have to hide all those edges inwards. So in order to do so, I'm just going to fold the rest of the lining of the top part, and I'm just going to be hand sewing this part. Of course, you can use your machine to do this, but I find it's a little bit too bulky, so I'm just going to be hand sewing it. In my opinion, you have much more control when you're hand sewing a piece like this, and also it's pretty relaxing, so just watch a film or something while you're doing it, and you just don't need to pay a lot of attention to it, just carry on and go with the flow. I'm going to assemble the collar next. In order to do so, as usual, you want to put your fabric right sides together and make sure that you don't put your fabric the wrong way around when you are sewing it, like I did with parts. I am going to fix this first before I do the rest of the collar. Yay! Just remember when you are sewing, we want to leave the opening for the neck open because that's gonna join to the top part and the bottom part of the collar. So just sew around everywhere else. It is very important to be consistent with the edge of this part because, as you know, we have painted this beforehand, and if we make it too thick or not thick enough, it's gonna show on the front that some parts are gonna be wider than others, so you wanna make sure that you are doing this as exactly as possible. Once more, we are gonna be turning. If you don't know exactly where to turn, it's okay to just put a little bit of hint of where to turn your fabric. I'm gonna cut that edge as before, just one stitch will do, and then turn it again. And as you saw before, this is gonna help us get a crisp edge. And once again, don't forget to cut that extra bulk before you turn your fabric. Even better if you do it all the way around. And once again, we had a perfect corner. Did you know about this trick? Just let us know in the comments if you knew about it and if there is any other tricks that you would like to share with us. It's great to learn together. And this is how the pieces look once I saw all the corners. Also, if you can notice, I actually did a second layer of paint because it was doing my head in and I thought it was a little bit too see-through. Also, look at the corner at the top. Honestly, I don't know how I did this. Yeah, just keep practicing. I've been doing this for 10 years, but I'm still surprised whenever I have crisp corners like that. By the way, if your corner is completely straight, you actually don't need to clip it. You can just fold it like this and you hold it very securely with your fingers before you turn them, and then when you turn it, it looks perfect like this. Ta-da! It looks even better once you have ironed it, but yeah, not bad, eh? Now you just need to attach the parts of the collar together. If you notice, I've done it so there's a little gap at the back of my collar because it's gonna be hidden anyway, and there's no point trying to make them both match together. So I started by leaving about 1 centimeter or 2 at the edge. Obviously, I did this from the center, and whatever was left at the back was the space left at the back. It's much easier this way, in my opinion, and you don't need to worry about it matching completely. You just need to, as before, sew this part, trying to avoid sewing the lining, and you're going to be sewing the collar to the top band of the collar as well. Notice that I had put the bottom part on top of it so I can see exactly where I'm sewing, and what I need to do is try to make sure that that center is going to be just catching both parts, and for this they may overlap a little bit at the bottom, but when I'm sewing it I make sure that there is no gap between them and they are just flush once against each other. And this is how it looks. And now, as I usually do when I finish my lining, I'm just going to be hand sewing this part. Again, this is to have more control to where my stitches are going, because otherwise you have to do a very narrow stitch in order to hide it a little bit, and sometimes the fabric gets out of place and it's more annoying. I personally find it easier to just hand sew this part and forget about all the bulk and how difficult it is to do it with the sewing machine. But if you are just in a hurry, you can just do it with the sewing machine, no problem with that. Finally, I just added a couple of snap buttons at the back and my collar was ready. Now, the last big part I'm going to do is the front of my Ganyu cosplay. For this part, I did not use lining and I kind of regret not using lining this time, but anyways, I'm going to show you what I did instead. Mine was a little bit short because I forgot to leave any seam allowance at the bottom, so what I did was using some bias tape, which was both to keep as much of the length as I could, and because the bottom of this front part is slightly curved, it's much easier to use bias tape on anything curved at the bottom because it's gonna look better than if you were to just fold this part. I completely turned my bias tape inwards and I have already ironed it, as you can see, leaving a little bit of the bottom facing inwards so you don't see the lining, or in this case the bias tape, at all. And once again, I'm just going to be hand sewing this part just to hide all the stitches I am doing. You can top stitch it, but I just didn't want to ruin that drawing that I did at the front with a line of stitches that is not going to match perfectly well the color. So what you can do is just trying to literally get a thread at a time. Just sew this part by hand. It takes a little bit of practice, but if you get it, it's gonna look so good at the front that's gonna make it totally worth it. Again, I would have avoided all these if I had just used some lining instead, but it's looking pretty good, and because my fabric was very thick, it's not going to be see-through. I'm going to be doing the front part, which is a little bit more tricky next, and my cats are demonstrating how fluffy and comfortable this batting is. Basically, this stuff is a thick layer of some kind of wool or cotton, which is used for crafting like quilting, and this one is adhesive, so if I use some heat on it, it's going to stick to my fabric. Like she's demonstrating, it's very fluffy and comfortable. I'm just going to be tracing this part on my batting because I've always found it easier to cut all your batting or any lining to the exact measurements to avoid the extra bulk on the hems. So once I have it, I'm just gonna cut it and just gonna glue it to this fabric, which is slightly stretchy. This is gonna help avoid any odd shapes when I am top stitching it. Have my cats told you yet how terribly comfy this fabric is? Sometimes I'm so tempted. Here is a batting already glued. I just use heat from my iron, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the other piece underneath so I can sew the top. You just need to sew the very top of this part, and you can follow the edge of your batting, so it's very easy to get it right. Once it's done, I just have to cut the excess, and don't forget to clip those corners before you turn your fabric. I'm also going to top stitch the fabric following the edge of my batting, and I'm going to be drawing the rest of the motif on this part of the fabric before I top stitch everything and make it look like a 3D effect. Notice that I used a pen that will erase with heat, so it won't be seen later on. If you are not using this, you can use something else like tailor's chalk or just a very faint pencil, but just keep in mind this is gonna be seen, so you wanna make sure that you either can't see it later on or you can just get rid of it. Once you have all the lines sewn, we are going to trim that excess fabrics because we don't need so much around it, but leave some space because we still need to attach this part to the rest of the top area. Before I can attach the red part, I need to make this diamond shape cut to the front of my fabric. I just interspaced a piece of fabric and I drew the shape of my diamond on it, and I'm just going to be sewing it before I cut it out. Once again, cut close to the edge, but make sure not to break the thread. Now you can turn your fabric and iron it. Notice that it will resist a little bit, and you will definitely need to iron those parts to make them look as crisp as possible. This is normal because it's a very tiny corner, and just go with it, just try to put it where you want it, and the iron will help you keep it in place. This is how it will look once you iron it. I also noticed that I got rid of the excess fabric and I trimmed those edges so there's not a lot of bulk behind it. I use my pinking shears for this, and this will avoid any fraying. And now it's finally time to attach the red part to the front. This is going to be perhaps the only time in which I'm going to top stitch this part, because I want to make sure this part is very secure. So I'm just going to go around the edges of this to make sure all that red part is going to be attached. Very briefly, I'm going to mention that there were a couple of lines that I didn't do last time, which were supposed to be grey or silver, and I had a little bit left over of my vinyl from my last Seabreeze Dandelion cosplay, so I decided to use it to add these lines to it. You can see how I did the whole process on the other videos, so I actually took like horrible footage to do this, so this is the best I can offer you. It's very satisfying to peel it, and it was very quickly, but again I only did this with vinyl because I had it at home, otherwise I would have painted it as I did with the rest of the parts. I also ironed my tail using some heat, and if you can, use some steam to make sure those lines are crisp, and it's very easy because you just have to follow the lines on the pattern. And it creates this awesome cascade effect. I hand sew the hems for some of the other pieces, just folding them and just doing this by hand. Could have totally top stitched it, and if you can afford it, I would suggest to line them as well because they will look much better. And like that, all my pieces were done. And here's the cosplay so far. It doesn't fit my mannequin so well because my mannequin has no legs and no arms and no butt, and it doesn't fit it, and obviously it's missing all the closures and all the attachments, but I can't do that until I do the next part, which is going to be the vinyl, and I'm going to be putting all this gold and all these flourishes around the cosplay to make it look super cool. Make sure that you like and subscribe to the channel if you want to see this next part. Also, you may have noticed that I haven't shown you how I made the bow at the back, nor the actual bodysuit. This is because, as I said, this is an older project that I started last year, and I don't have footage of this that I can use on YouTube. However, you can see how I made it on my Instagram, so if you want to check it out, just make sure you follow me there as well. I get all the progress pictures on my stories all the time, and I put short videos and short images of what I'm doing at the time all the time. As always, thank you very much for watching, and thank you to my Patreons to help me do this. Without you, it wouldn't be possible. It's slowly growing, and I really like to show many more things to you guys. Thank you very much for watching, and see you next time. Bye!